Hello, folks. Welcome to our weekly live chat. We'll wait for some folks to come on. I know there is some interest in this discussion topic today, which is exciting for me because sometimes I feel like I'm the only one who gets excited about certain topics. But Merry belated Christmas to everyone, and we'll wait for folks to come on to get into the details of this week's topic, which is cursive writing, and I'll talk about why that. It's kind of an off-the-wall topic idea that came to me as I was reading the newspaper over the weekend. Because, like most of you, if you live in Western New York, I know I have a few folks who listen from elsewhere. We were under a lot of snow and travel bans, and we couldn't go anywhere. So we had a lot of time to sit home and read, perhaps, or watch some television. But I was reading the New York Times, and that's where I came up with this idea. To talk about cursive writing, so in a little bit. But we, of course, we're always talking about the weather, right? It is quite funny, not funny, haha, but funny, coincidental funny, that I was finishing up my weekly column that gets published in the Easter Advertiser. It'll be published this week, I presume. And I was finishing it up and sending it in on Friday morning. And the topic, I'll give away the topic for this week, was comparing the history of November storms, essentially, specifically November storms, because we get a lot of blizzards and a lot of storms. And I was kind of intrigued by the fact, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, right after that November storm we had, where it was very eerie. People were saying an eerie coincidence that this November storm in 2022 hit on the exact same day as the one in 2014. But then as I was reading through, doing a little research on it, I discovered that there have been many November storms, and you'll hear like newscasters like to say it's historic. We've never had a storm like this before. And in some cases that's true. The statistics might rise to the level of being historic and unprecedented. But in many cases we can find things that have happened before. And in this case I found a storm from and we've had this in the archives, this giant headline in a Buffalo newspaper that said East Aurora was buried under more than 5 feet of snow. Eerily, the exact same week, not the same day, but the same week of the November storms that we had in recent years. And it was interesting to read the reaction to the community, of the community to this storm. Buried, the trains, of course, the trains would be, modern day would be Route 400. The trains were closed. Route 400, was buried, and people couldn't get anywhere and were basically stuck for at least a couple days. But what I had found most interesting is as soon as that November storm happened, in all three cases, and I stuck to those. Have been other November storms, including one that came 13 years later that had got much more publicity because it was a Great Lakes storm and it impacted a much larger area. But I focused on those three storms, but the other storms we'd get over a foot of snow in November. And what I learned from a history perspective is that not all snowstorms are the same. And it's interesting, the blizzard we just had was defined by, yes, the amount of snow, but more the blowing snow and the wind. Blizzard of 77 was the same way. You look back on that and it was really the wind. Most of that snow had been sitting on a frozen Lake Erie and blew onto Western New York. November storms are more defined by the heavy, wet snow because it wasn't as cold. And so the snow, 5 feet of snow in November is different than the fluffy snow in December or January. So when you look back at snowstorms, it's interesting to figure out, not all snowstorms are the same. So buried under 5 feet of snow in November is different than blowing snow at the end of December or January. And what I found quite interesting, and in all cases in the November storms, is they got over real quickly. So yes, there was this huge this big impact immediately. For a few days we were all buried and we couldn't go anywhere, but all of a sudden there's a thaw and we move on. And for some people I know, the storms were a little more impactful, and actually in this last one the blizzard was fatal, and so that, of course, people can't move on as quickly from that, of course. But I found it very interesting that within a week of that November storm in 1900, the snow had melted and people had moved on with their lives. And the way it's looking like for East Aurora here with the blizzard in Western New York is that we're going to have temperatures in the 50s by the end of the week. So it's amazing how this pattern repeats itself, and that's meteorology. You talk to meteorologists, and the way the lakes have impacted our weather here in Western New York. It's just not much has changed. History does repeat itself when it comes to weather in that regard. Um, and another thing that I thought about over the weekend, and I've been chatting about even just today with somebody, was that how geography plays such a big role for this. We have been hearing on TV that this storm that we just had over the weekend is probably more historic than the blizzard of '77. I even think the governor had said that in one of the press conferences. And I was talking to somebody about that, and yes, this was a big storm for East Aurora, but it was huge for the city of Buffalo. And the blizzard of '77 will probably rank higher than this storm for the rural areas, because the blizzard of '77 was much more widespread. You had a lot of, just the reports I've read about it, I was only 2 years old, so I don't remember from personal experience, but they were, the rural areas were buried as well. And this storm we just had really was laser focused more so on, because it was more lake effect, and not just blowing snow everywhere. It was on the city of Buffalo. So Buffalo, yes, this would be a more historic storm perhaps than the blizzard of '77 for that geographic area where it hit, and less so for us. So for East Aurora, this might not rank high. We were out of the bullseye zone. We were impacted certainly by the traffic ban and hitting on Christmas, which is another factor. But the reaction of it was much different. Our perspective in the south towns and rural areas was much different. So geography plays a big role when you hear about historic storms, and one area may be impacted differently. For instance, for years when I was a kid, I kept hearing about the ice storm of '76. Well, in other areas of Western New York, you don't hear about it. It was East Aurora and surrounding areas were impacted more than some other areas. And my parents kept talking about that '76 storm, ice storm. I think it was in March, and that was something they were talking about even more than the blizzard of '77, because the ice was so destructive, and power went out for a lot of people. And that's another thing, like this storm is probably more historic for the people who've lost their power for days than those of us who didn't. So perspective is really important, and that goes back to my point of making sure you journal, because what the news is reporting, a reporter in Buffalo is, probably wherever they're stationed doing their reporting, and the people they talk to, that's one perspective, and yours might be different. So someone in 100 years looking back on the Christmas blizzard of 2022 might want to look back at what you have to say. So now on to our topic, the cursive and local history, and it may seem like those two things don't relate, but it was really interesting as I was reading the article. I'll share the link to it again, and the New York Times does have a paywall, but I think you do get some free articles to start out. So if you're not able, you should be able to read it but again, feel free to subscribe to the New York Times. I do. So that's where I came across this, and I was reading over the weekend, and there was this op-ed about whether or not, there was an op-ed a couple weeks ago about whether or not teaching cursive in schools is even worth it anymore. And the response this past weekend, what I was reading, were the letters to the editor that came in as a response to that opinion. And this op-ed writer had a position, he made some points about whether or not it's even worth it to teach cursive writing, because even old letters that you're reading, most of them, if they're online, they've been transcribed anyway, and so we really don't need to know how to write in cursive. And at first I thought maybe he was being sarcastic, but this follows a whole bunch of other articles. If you just look in the search on the New York Times or search Google, this argument's been going on for several years, probably a couple decades, ever since the computer, is whether we need to know how to read and write in cursive. And so, of course, light bulbs went off in my head as I was reading this, because I'll just share a story of what happened. Is I had a high school student volunteering in the historian's office, and they were going through old receipts. Someone had donated a bunch of receipts from local businesses in the 1920s and 30s, and some other letters. And he was going through and organizing them by date and topic and things like that. And he, just a random comment he made, and they were talking about putting them in chronological order, and if it was typed, he could see it, and he could see the numbers, so he knew what what order they should go in chronologically. But he said to me, Mr. Goller, I wish it'd be neat to know what this purchase was about. He was looking at one of the receipts. I said, what are you talking about? You can read it right there. And he goes, oh, I can't read the handwriting. And I thought, oh, he goes, he had learned cursive writing. And I know that there's a big argument over and big debate over teaching cursive handwriting in school. He had learned cursive handwriting. He had taken a course of it. But just like anything, like a foreign language, this was a foreign language to him, the cursive handwriting from the 1920s, because he hadn't used it over and over again. So, look how many of us take Spanish, 3 years of Spanish in high school, and we can't speak Spanish, because we're not using it every single day. We lose that skill. And it blew my mind that he couldn't read this receipt. And I thought, well, how many other people were in the same boat? And I did ask younger people around me, and some knew and some didn't. But the cursive handwriting has gone out of style. We don't handwrite things anymore. And that's true. I'm not exaggerating. I know, like, people talk about, nostalgia for cursive handwriting. And so I was like, oh, okay, very interesting. So he couldn't read the cursive handwriting on a receipt and a couple of other handwritten letters. And at first I was like, oh, that's kind of sad. But then I thought, practically, this is a problem. So, and then recently we found, and I don't know if you can see it, in the collection over at the archives, we found an edition from 1901 of Palmer's Penmanship Budget. And we have a kind of a strict policy at the historian's office of really focusing on items, artifacts, and documents and pictures related only to the town of Aurora, village of East Aurora, and the surrounding communities. Mostly because of space. We can't accept or keep things from just because they're interesting and just because they're old. We have to be very specific. So this penmanship booklet was on the chopping block, so to speak. Now, we wouldn't have thrown it out, but I would have tried to find a better home for it. We had no connection to East Aurora to it. But then I published it on Facebook, a couple of the pages of some of the lessons, and a lot of it's just repetitive writing, constantly rewriting and making your penmanship better, and drills essentially inside this book. And there's a lot of lessons inside. I posted it on Facebook, and the response was amazing. People remembered Palmer's penmanship lessons and had nostalgic thoughts about it. But then so that was sort of the second thing that got me thinking about cursive handwriting and how we're not teaching that anymore. But anyone who wants to go into knowing more and learning history really should focus on learning cursive handwriting if you don't. Because so many documents that were written, even government documents, were handwritten. So the vital statistics records in the clerk's office, county clerk's office, all your town clerk's offices, are handwritten. And in some cases, and I don't mean to brag, but I'm very good at reading cursive handwriting. And it's not something that I remember ever learning. I remember learning cursive handwriting in school, but I think it's just become a muscle memory thing for me. I look at so many documents throughout the day, and I do handwrite a lot. I do still write personal letters, but reading old letters and reading captions that people have written on the back of photographs, and I really think I've just by accident built a muscle memory where it's just automatic. It's like riding a bike. I don't even think about it. So when this young man in my office who couldn't read the cursive, it blew my mind, like, because I just took for granted I was able to read that handwriting on that receipt, no problem. I read it just as if I was reading it. But if you were to present something to me in Greek or Russian or French, I wouldn't be able to read it. And so that's sort of how I was trying to relate to him, is like, this is really a foreign language for him. He couldn't read the cursive handwriting. And sometimes one of the clerks will call me up, or will another historian will like have me look at something. It's in English, but it's even the old fancy cursive handwriting, and trying to figure out what does that say. And you sometimes have to take the time to really read it. But if you have no concept of cursive handwriting, you're not gonna be able to read it at all. So that's the point I'm making with how important cursive handwriting and learning it and maintaining it, even more importantly, is important to the study of local history. Because a lot of the things that we have in the archives, or just that you come across in your family files, your grandmother probably wrote cursive when she wrote on the back of photographs. Diaries were probably written in cursive. And how F's looked a lot like S's. And if you train your brain to do that, you can read it much more easily. To know that an F and an S sometimes looks interchangeable when people are writing their names. And again, this was in, the marriage logs, the death logs, the birth certificate logs, and in a lot of the government clerks' offices back in the old days, minutes of board meetings, of the town board meetings, the county legislature meetings, the board of supervisors back in the day, all handwritten in these old ledgers. And the point that the op-ed was making, that that if this stuff is all going to be online, and a lot of things are getting digitized, government records are getting digitized, that someone's going to transcribe them. And so we don't need to know how to read cursive, because it'll already be transcribed and in a text format, a typed format. And I got to thinking, well, that's interesting, because who's going to transcribe it? You're counting on somebody being able to read that handwriting. And that's great for the congressional record in Washington, D.C., where they have staff and professional people at the National Archives and things. But what about your local town? What about your family history? What about your family letters? If you have letters from your great-grandmother and you have no idea how to read them because we haven't kept up on the cursive, that's going to be a problem. So that's the point I was trying to make, and I was getting real frustrated with the folks with the op-ed, and I was glad to be sort of redeemed in the letters to the editor that followed. And I'll post both of those. But again, what can you do is just, I think, write more. If we, write, a lot of us do know cursive, and we can write journals. And again, I hate to keep beating that drum, but having things in your own handwriting for future generations. But again, writing letters and writing cursive, and it seems silly, but I think that's what built the muscle memory that some of us have when we're looking at old documents. And even, again, things stump us. We'll look through I'll just give you more examples. The Reverend Sanford, Richard Sanford, we called him the marrying minister in East Aurora. We have, even before vital statistics were required, he kept a log of all the people he married, all the funerals, and it's a handwritten log. So when you're going through that log, and we are in the process of transcribing a lot of these things, but again, our volunteer needs to be able to know how to read it, or I need to know how to read it, or somebody else who's helping transcribe these documents needs to know how to read it. So I get a little frustrated when we start talking about, well, we don't need to know handwriting anymore, and we don't need to be able to read. It's just frustrating, because we do. And so I will, penmanship and handwriting is important. And, technology, we keep talking about, we're holding these phones around all the time, and we're able to just type in, or we're making comments on Facebook. But when you keep a physical journal, what you type into this phone, how many of us have thousands and thousands of pictures on this phone that never see the light of day? They're just stuffed in there or on the cloud somewhere. But if you have a physical book that you've handwritten, a journal, or you've printed out a photograph, and it might get thrown in a drawer, but somebody someday is going to find it in that drawer. Not so sure they're going to find it on a computer, on a cloud, in a phone, especially when the phones don't last forever. We get new phones every couple years, right? And we maybe transfer the pictures, but we don't label the pictures, all that sort of thing. So that's why I think handwriting is important, and making sure it's legible. and being able to read the things that came before us. So in the end, we are keeping this, even though it's not, we're making an exception to the rule in the historian's office where we're going to keep this because this would have been a book budget. They called it the budget, but this little textbook would have been something East Aurorans would have used. And I didn't really even think about the connection between the two handwriting and local history until I came across these circumstances where I was like, wow, yeah, that is really important. And we really need to focus on if we don't know how to write, maybe just being able to decipher what other people have written in the past. And so if you have young people around you, and I actually heard, they heard that they were they had stopped teaching handwriting, cursive writing in school. But then I heard there was a movement to bring it back because what happened? Well, we couldn't read. That young man I pointed out, and I don't mean to pick on him because there's others as well, and even adults who just got out of the rhythm of reading cursive writing and writing in cursive. So if you want you want to instill a skill in a young person, is tell them to learn how to do cursive writing, especially if they want to go into archive work or history. That is going to be a skill that they're going to be able to use because I have a feeling there's going to be a group of people that don't have that skill. So if they build that skill, it'll be a marketable thing to be able to say, it sounds weird, but you're in a job interview. I can read cursive handwriting, and I know in archival work, museum work, history, research work, that there are courses being taught in deciphering old handwriting and basically cursive writing. And so they're teaching it at a higher educational level because it wasn't happening. They were doing it anyway, but that it's not, if it's not happening in third grade, like I remember learning cursive handwriting in Mrs. Case Law's third grade class, if we're not learning it there, or if we're learning it there and forgetting about it because we're not handwriting our tests, we're typing them in, we're typing our essays into a computer rather than writing it out, we're losing that skill. So when you go into museum work or research, and you're going into an archive or just your family's files, and you're trying to read something, having that skill is very important. So that's the link between local history and cursive handwriting. And I know some people might have been like, "Why that's a stretch of a of a link." No, directly related, and I just realized that. It dawned on me through these experiences that I've had just working with local archives and things like that. So 9 out of 10 times things are handwritten, not typed up neatly. And so, and a lot of times too, even things that are transcribed, census records, nothing I never thought about. So the 1950 census that was just recently released, there's actually, if I recall correctly, when we were first looking at it, they were transcribing it. However, a lot of the times it was transcribed wrong. So they were relying on the public. They were saying, hey, if you see that your family name is spelled wrong or you think there's a mistake, they had a mechanism on their website to send in to make a correction. Because the F's and the S's look so much alike, even people transcribing it, or a computer program that was trying to transcribe the information was having trouble with it. So all the census records in the early days were handwritten. And so again, if you don't know how to read the handwriting or you struggle with that skill, there's a whole vast amount of information that you can't have access to. And again, that argument that, oh, well, the census records are all transcribed. Well, they're transcribed by somebody and they're corrected by somebody. And if we can't read it, then how are we going to correct it? So there's just a value in knowing how to read the handwriting. And again, it's government records, but the census, that's a perfect example. I had an example where I was trying to read, there was a young woman here in East Aurora, and I found her dad in the census. I was trying to figure out where she lived back in 1900. And and I read it as house framer was his occupation. So they had his occupation across. And I was like, house framer, well, that's a strange thing to say about someone who builds houses. Like usually they'd say a laborer or a construction worker. Well, I went away from it and came back and looked, and all of a sudden, I think because of me being used to reading, but even I couldn't read it at first. Horse trainer. I was reading horse as house, and it, it just didn't look right at first. But after looking at it for a while, but it was handwritten, and of course everybody's handwriting is different. And the census taker, you're at their mercy essentially. So again, all that information was really important, and they when they transcribed, they didn't have a transcription for that page of the census. So I had no other way of finding out that information if I didn't know how to read it. And so, of course, there was certain websites that have the census information, the genealogy websites, and so I was able to like submit what I thought it said. So basically transcribing, group sourcing of the transcription, and add to it. But again, it takes a little time. But I think that was just because I looked at it a little bit and knew how to read cursive writing. So there are a vast amount of local history documents that are in cursive that it's valuable to know. So long story short, before we run out of time, and if you do have any questions, I know a lot of people watch this later, so I do enjoy getting the reactions and getting the comments later and questions. And please, if you have experience with cursive writing, let me know. It'd be interesting to hear. But again, it's not just a cursive handwriting isn't just, the loss of cursive handwriting isn't just this nostalgic thing. Oh, we're losing part of what used to be a charming thing. People used to handwrite their letters, that charming thing. There's an actual practical loss that we have if we don't know how to read handwriting. It's not just this nostalgic thing, this, oh, we're losing a part of what the good old days used to be. There's more to it, that we're losing an ability to transcribe and read old documents and learn history if we don't know how to read that handwriting. So practical reason to keep cursive. And so I disagree with that op-ed writer in the New York Times about whether or not we should be teaching cursive handwriting. Not just cursive either, just all penmanship, how to identify. And some of that is just something you have to learn by doing and reading old documents. And I think it just kind of gives you the muscle memory to kind of do it on your own, and have your brain work a certain way of reading. And if you work with that sort of thing all the time, I think you just kind of build that skill. So again, please leave comments in the comment section, or send me a private message if you're not comfortable putting it out there publicly. And I enjoy chatting with you about even obscure topics like this one that don't seem like they relate to local history. And we'll be back next Tuesday. Have a happy new year. And I think next Tuesday we're going to talk about unless something else comes up or some other idea gets into my head. And I welcome your topics, so please send them in. A few people did. And one of those topics is school mascots and school names, Native American especially mascots. But we're going to talk about East Aurora and Iroquois. There's a debate currently about the use of Native American, American Indian mascots and names. But East Aurora's, the Blue Devil, also has an interesting history and has been controversial. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So I think that'll be our topic for next week. Again, thanks for joining me, either live or later. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.